sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones who insist they're fine. We've all been there, pretending everything's okay when our world is falling apart. That's exactly what happens when Eric Dalton walks into Riverside Urgent Care, telling Nurse Mara Langley that his deep infected wound is just a scratch from work. But Mara has 20 years of experience reading between the lines. She notices the old scars, the fresh bruises, the way he won't meet her eyes. Eric isn't just hiding the truth about his injury. He's covering up a dangerous secret that's slowly destroying his life. As Mara digs deeper, she realizes that helping him means facing some hard truths about her own life too. What happens when two people who've been running from their problems finally decide to stop? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As she cleaned the wound, preparing it for proper treatment, her trained eyes caught other details that made her pause. An old scar on his forearm, perfectly round and about the size of a cigarette burn, though Eric didn't smell like a smoker. Bruising along his ribs that showed through his thin shirt, yellow-green and at least a week old. Small cuts on his knuckles that looked like they came from handling rough materials without proper gloves. "You said this happened at the construction site?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Yeah, caught a piece of rebar that was sticking out. Should have been paying better attention." The wound pattern didn't match that story. Rebar would have created a puncture or a scrape, not this clean, deep cut that looked more like it came from sharp metal or broken glass. And the infection level suggested he'd been working in contaminated conditions, not the relatively clean environment of a legitimate construction site. Dr. Chun appeared in the doorway, her small frame radiating the calm authority that had made her one of the most respected physicians in the county. She'd worked with Mara long enough to read the subtle signals, the slight tension in Mara's shoulders, the way she was taking extra time with the examination. "How are we doing in here?" Dr. Chun asked, her voice carrying the same professional warmth as Mara's, but with an undertone that suggested she was prepared for complications. "Deep laceration, significant infection," Mara reported. "I'm concerned about the progression. This needs immediate antibiotic treatment and proper wound care." Eric shifted uncomfortably on the examination table. "Look, I appreciate what you're doing, but I really need to get back to work. Can you just clean it up and give me something for the pain?" It was then that his phone buzzed with a text message. Eric glanced at it and went pale, his hands actually trembling slightly as he read whatever was on the screen. Mara caught a glimpse of the message before he could turn the phone away. "Time's running out. Friday deadline still stands." The pieces began falling into place in Mara's mind: the mysterious injury, the obvious financial stress, the text message that clearly wasn't from a legitimate employer. She'd seen enough over the years to recognize when someone was in trouble, real trouble, the kind that made people take risks they'd never normally consider. "Mr. Dalton," she said gently, "this infection could become serious very quickly. If it spreads to your bloodstream, you could be looking at sepsis, possibly hospitalization. Whatever work you're worried about, it's not worth risking your life." Eric looked at her, then really looked at her, and for a moment his careful facade cracked. She saw desperation there, the kind that came from being trapped between impossible choices. But then his expression hardened again, and he was back to being the stoic construction worker who could handle anything. "I appreciate the concern, but I know my body. I've been hurt worse than this and been fine." Mara finished cleaning and bandaging the wound, knowing she was fighting a losing battle but unable to give up completely. She handed him a prescription for antibiotics and detailed wound care instructions, along with her business card. "Promise me you'll take the full course of antibiotics," she said. "And if the redness spreads, if you develop a fever, or if the pain gets worse, you come back immediately, day or night." Eric nodded, but she could tell he was already mentally out the door, focused on whatever crisis was waiting for him in the outside world. As he left, limping slightly but trying to hide it, Mara found herself staring after him with an unusual sense of unease. That evening, alone in her neat but lifeless apartment, Mara couldn't stop thinking about Eric Dalton. She had treated thousands of patients over the years, and most of them blended together in her memory, becoming case studies rather than people. But something about Eric had gotten under her skin, past the professional detachment she'd worked so hard to maintain. She found herself researching wound infections on her laptop, reading about the progression from local infection to systemic sepsis, about the timeline between initial injury and life-threatening complications. The medical facts were clear. Eric was playing with fire, and unless he took proper care of himself, he could be in serious trouble within days. But it wasn't just medical concern keeping her awake that night. There had been something familiar in Eric's eyes, something she recognized from her own mirror on the worst days after her divorce. The look of someone who'd lost their way, who was making decisions based on desperation rather than wisdom. Someone who convinced themselves they could handle whatever life threw at them, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Mara made a decision that would prove to be more significant than she could have imagined. If Eric Dalton came back and her instincts told her he would, she wasn't going to let him disappear again without getting some real answers. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above Riverside Urgent Care as another Thursday afternoon unfolded in suburban predictability. Nurse Mara Langley adjusted her worn badge from 2020 years of dedication pinned to her scrubs. Like a badge of honor she'd forgotten how to feel proud of. The weight of 2 decades caring for others had settled into her shoulders. A comfortable ache that reminded her daily of the woman she used to be. At 44, Mara possessed the kind of intuitive medical sense that couldn't be taught in nursing school. She could spot a drug seeker from across the waiting room, identify domestic violence behind clumsy excuses, and sense when someone's chest pain was anxiety masquerading as a heart attack. Her colleagues often joked that she had X-ray vision, but Mara knew it was something simpler and sadder. She'd learned to read people because she'd spent so many years not wanting to look too closely at herself. The afternoon light filtered through the clinic's large windows, casting long shadows. Across the intake desk where Janet Martinez, their perpetually cheerful receptionist, processed a steady stream of patients. Janet had worked here almost as long as Mara, and together they developed an unspoken rhythm that kept the small facility running smoothly. Dr. Patricia Chen, their supervising physician, trusted Mara's instincts implicitly, often saying she wished more nurses possessed Mara's combination of clinical skill and emotional intelligence. But Mara felt anything but emotionally intelligent these days. Since her divorce 3 years ago, she'd been moving through life like she was underwater, everything muted, distant, requiring tremendous effort to accomplish the simplest tasks. Work had become her refuge, the one place where her competence remained unquestioned, where her value felt concrete and measurable. The waiting room held its usual collection of Thursday afternoon complaints: a college student with a sprained ankle from intramural soccer, an elderly gentleman with what appeared to be a minor allergic reaction, a young mother juggling a feverish toddler while trying to fill out paperwork. Mara had seen variations of these same stories thousands of times, and she moved between them with practiced efficiency, taking vitals, asking the right questions, providing reassurance where medical facts felt insufficient. She was updating charts at the nurse's station when the automatic door slid open and Eric Dalton went inside. Even from across the room, Mara could tell this one was different. He moved like a man carrying invisible weight, each step deliberate and carefully controlled. His work shirt stained with what looked like old blood and something else she couldn't immediately identify hung loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. Most telling was the way he approached Janet's desk, apologetic, almost deferent, like he was imposing on everyone simply by existing. Eric Dalton was 46 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested someone who'd packed extra years into his time on Earth. His hands, when he filled out the intake forms, bore the calluses and scars of 2 decades in construction work. He'd been a foreman for the last 8 years at Henderson & Sons Construction, known throughout the county for quality work and reliable deadlines. But those who looked closely might have noticed that his usual confident bearing had been replaced by something more fragile, more uncertain. The divorce papers in his wallet had been signed 6 months ago, but Eric still reached for his phone, sometimes to call Linda with work stories before remembering she wouldn't be interested anymore. The studio apartment he'd moved into felt like a temporary arrangement, even though the lease ran through next year. Everything felt temporary now: his living situation, his financial stability, his sense of who he was supposed to be as a man approaching 50, with nothing to show for 23 years of marriage except alimony payments and a pickup truck. With 180,000 miles, Mr. Dalton? Mara's voice carried the professional warmth she'd perfected over the years, inviting without being intrusive. She led him to exam room 3, noting his gait, the way he favored his left leg, the careful way he lowered himself onto the examination table. "So what brings you in today?" she asked, pulling on gloves with the efficient movements of someone who'd performed this routine thousands of times. "It's really nothing," Eric said, and Mara heard the lie immediately. Not because he was trying to deceive her, but because he was trying to deceive himself. "Just a scratch from work. My foreman said I should get it looked at, company policy and all." But when Eric rolled up his pant leg to reveal the wound on his thigh, Mara's breath caught slightly. The gash was at least 4 inches long, angry, and red around the edges with the telltale signs of infection she'd seen too many times to count. This was no scratch. This was a deep laceration that had been neglected for days, possibly a week. The skin around it was hot to the touch, and she could smell the beginning of systemic infection. "When did this happen?" she asked, beginning her examination with gentle, practiced hands. "Tuesday," Eric sighed, then corrected himself. "Maybe Monday. Hard to remember exactly." Mara glanced up at him, noting the way his eyes shifted away from hers. In her experience, people always remembered exactly when they got injured. The ones who claimed fuzzy memories were usually hiding something, either about how the injury occurred or how long they'd been ignoring it. 2 days later, Eric Dalton was back. Mara saw him through the waiting room window before he'd even made it to the door, recognizing his distinctive gait and the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. This time, however, his limp was more pronounced, and the pallor of his skin was visible even from a distance. Janet looked up from her computer screen as Eric approached the reception desk. "Back again, Mr. Dalton? Let me guess, that scratch is feeling a bit worse." Eric managed a weak smile, something like that. Mara appeared at his side before he'd finished signing in. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know about how the last 48 hours had gone. His eyes were glassy with fever, and she could see a fine sheen of sweat across his forehead, despite the cool October air outside. "Exam. Room 2, she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that made Janet look up sharply from her paperwork. Once the door closed behind them, Eric's facade crumbled completely. He sagged against the examination table like a man who'd been holding himself upright through sheer willpower, and now that he was in a safe space, his body was finally admitting defeat. The infection's worse, isn't it? Mara asked, though it wasn't really a question. She was already reaching for her thermometer and blood pressure cuff. I took the pills you gave me, Eric said defensively. Most of them, anyway. But it started hurting more yesterday, and this morning I could barely get my pants on. When Eric rolled up his pant leg this time, Mara had to suppress a sharp intake of breath. The wound site was significantly larger than it had been 2 days ago, angry red streaks radiating outward in the telltale pattern of cellulitis. The infection was spreading, moving toward his lymph nodes, and if it reached his bloodstream, they'd be looking at a medical emergency. Eric, she said, using his first name for the first time, you need to be in a hospital. This isn't something we can treat with oral antibiotics anymore. No, his response was immediate and panicked. No hospitals. I can't afford. I don't have insurance that covers. Look, just give me stronger pills or something. Mara paused in her examination, studying his face. You said you worked construction? Don't you have workers' compensation coverage? For a moment, Eric looked like he might actually tell her the truth. His mouth opened, then closed, and she could see him weighing his options, calculating risks she couldn't fully understand. It's complicated, he finally said. Complicated how? Eric's phone buzzed again. This time he didn't bother hiding the screen from her. Perhaps because the fever was making him less careful, or perhaps because some part of him wanted her to see. The message was from a contact labeled simply M. Talk to the boys. You miss Friday's job. We're done. No more work, no more understanding about what you owe. Mara read the message before Eric could pull the phone away, and suddenly several pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The injury that didn't match his story, the desperation, the threats about money, the refusal to seek proper medical care. Eric, she said quietly, what kind of work are you really doing? He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Construction, mostly, but the regular jobs, they're not enough anymore. Not since the divorce. Linda got the house and the lawyer fees and the alimony. He stopped, looking exhausted by the effort of explanation. So you're taking side jobs, cash, work, off the books. It pays better because it's not exactly up to code, if you know what I mean. Mara didn't know what he meant. She treated enough construction workers over the years to understand the underground economy that existed alongside legitimate building work. Projects that cut corners on safety regulations, used undocumented workers, operated without proper permits or insurance. The kind of work that paid well precisely because it was dangerous. How did you really get hurt? Eric looked at her for a long moment, seeming to weigh whether he could trust her with the truth. Something in her expression must have convinced him, because when he spoke again, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a heavy secret alone. We were taking down some old equipment in a warehouse. Stuff that should have been removed by professionals, but the owner wanted to save money. There was broken glass everywhere, old machinery with sharp edges. I was trying to move fast. We only had a few hours before the owner came back, and I caught my leg on a piece of metal sheeting. And you didn't clean it properly because you had to keep working, and because the place was filthy. Looked like it had been abandoned for years. Dust, bird droppings, God knows what else. But the pay for one night was more than I make in a week at my regular job. Mara finished her examination in thoughtful silence. Eric's temperature was 101.3. His blood pressure was elevated, and the lymph nodes in his groin were swollen and tender. All signs that the infection was becoming systemic. Without immediate intervention, he could be looking at sepsis within 24 hours. Eric, I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said. This infection is spreading through your lymphatic system. If it gets into your bloodstream, you could die. Not might die, could die. As in, this is a medical emergency. But if I go to the hospital, you'll be alive to worry about the bills later. Eric laughed bitterly. You don't understand. I'm already behind on everything. The divorce lawyer, the alimony, my rent. I've got creditors calling me 3 times a day. If I miss this job on Friday, I lose the only income source that's keeping me afloat. What kind of job requires you to work with a serious infection? Eric's phone buzzed again. This time the message was longer, and Mara could see his hands shaking as he read it. When he looked up, there was something approaching panic in his eyes. They want me to do demolition work on an old factory building. It's supposed to be empty, condemned, ready to come down anyway. But they need it done fast, and they need someone who knows how to work quietly. The implications of quietly weren't lost on Mara. This wasn't legitimate demolition work. This was someone trying to destroy evidence, or clear out a building without proper permits, or worse. Eric, this sounds dangerous. Not just because you're sick, but because it's illegal. He laughed again, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, I figured that out. But illegal work pays better than legal work, and right now I need the money more than I need my conscience. Dr. Chun appeared in the doorway, having been alerted by Mara's urgent message about Eric's condition. She took one look at the wound site and Eric's flushed face and immediately understood the situation. Mr. Dalton and Dr. Chun, Nurse Langley, has filled me in on your condition. I'm recommending immediate hospitalization for 4 antibiotic therapy. I already told her, and I'm telling you that your other problems won't matter if you're dead. Dr. Chun's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen too many patients make fatal mistakes out of pride or fear. This infection is spreading. You have maybe 12 hours before it becomes life-threatening. Eric looked between the two women, trapped between impossible choices. Mara could see the moment when desperation won out over common sense. Can you give me something to get me through? Until Saturday? Some kind of shot or stronger pills? I'll come back after the job, I promise. That's not how infections work, Mara said gently. This isn't something you can push through with willpower. But Eric was already standing up, already reaching for his jacket. I'm sorry. I know you're trying to help, but you don't understand my situation. I can't afford to be sick right now. He headed for the door, moving stiffly but with obvious determination. At the threshold, he turned back to look at Mara. Thanks for trying, he said. You're a good nurse. But some of us don't have the luxury of making smart choices. And then he was gone, leaving Mara staring after him with a mixture of frustration and genuine fear. She'd seen patients make poor decisions before, but there was something about Eric's situation that felt different. More urgent, more dangerous than simple medical noncompliance. That evening, Mara found herself researching everything she could. Find about construction site infections, about the progression from cellulitis to sepsis, about the timeline between initial symptoms and organ failure. The medical literature was clear. Eric had maybe 24 hours before his condition became critical, but she also found herself thinking about the desperation in his eyes. The way he'd looked at that threatening text message, the impossible choice between financial survival and physical survival. She treated enough patients over the years to recognize when someone was trapped, when they were making decisions based on fear rather than logic. As she prepared for bed, Mara made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. If Eric Dalton was determined to risk his life for money, someone needed to make sure he understood exactly what that risk entailed. And if he was going to make a potentially fatal mistake, he wasn't going to do it without someone trying one. More time to talk sense into him. Tomorrow, she was going to find Eric Dalton and have a conversation that went well beyond the normal boundaries of nurse-patient relationships. Because sometimes Mara realized helping people meant caring enough to interfere. The next morning brought Eric back to Riverside Urgent Care, though this time he didn't walk through the front door so much as he stumbled through it. Janet took one look at his condition and immediately called for Mara, who appeared within seconds. Her face a mixture of relief and concern. I was hoping you'd come back, she said, guiding him toward exam room 2 with a steadying hand on his elbow. Though I was hoping you'd look better when you did. Eric's fever had clearly worsened overnight. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and she could see him shivering despite the warm sweater he'd pulled on over his work shirt. Most telling was the way he moved carefully, like someone whose body was no longer entirely under his control. The pills aren't working, he admitted as he lowered himself onto the examination table. And the pain, it's different now, deeper. When Mara examined the wound this time, she found exactly what she'd feared. The red streaking had progressed significantly, tracking up his thigh toward his groin. The wound site itself was hot to the touch and showed signs of developing an abscess. His temperature was 102.1, and his heart rate was elevated, all signs that his body was fighting a losing battle against systemic infection. Eric, she said gently, this can't wait anymore. You need to be in a hospital, I know. His voice was barely audible. I called in sick to my regular job today. First time in 3 years. But the other thing, the Friday job, I still need to do that. Mara sat down on the rolling stool, bringing herself to his eye level. Tell me about your regular work. You said you've been a foreman for 8 years? Eric nodded, grateful for the change of subject. Henderson and Sons Construction. Good company, honest people. Though Henderson gave me a chance when I was just a laborer, taught me the business. We do commercial work, mostly office buildings, small industrial projects. Nothing fancy, but solid work. And you've been reliable. Never missed a deadline. Never had a safety violation. Bill used to joke that I was the most dependable guy he'd ever hired. Eric's voice carried a note of pride that was quickly replaced by something darker. Of course, that was before everything fell apart. The divorce. 23 years of marriage, and it ended over money. Isn't that something? Not another woman, not growing apart money. Linda said I wasn't ambitious enough, that I was content to stay a foreman forever while other guys our age were starting their own companies, making real money. Mara listened while she prepared to clean and redress his wound, noting how Eric seemed to relax as he talked. She'd learned over the years that sometimes the best medicine was simply letting people tell their story. So you decided to take on extra work? Started about 6 months ago? Just occasional stuff at first, helping friends with side projects. Doing small jobs on weekends, cash work, but legitimate. Then Linda's lawyer started talking about alimony, and the bills started piling up, and suddenly weekend work wasn't enough. As Mara worked on his wound, she noticed something she'd missed before. Eric's hands, despite his claims of regular construction work, showed evidence of different types of labor. Alongside the expected calluses and scrapes were chemical burns. On his fingertips, stains under his nails that looked like they came from industrial solvents, and small cuts that suggested he'd been handling materials without proper gloves. Eric, these marks on your hands, they don't look like they came from regular construction work. He glanced down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The side jobs are different. The guys who pay cash, they're not as careful about safety protocols. No OSHA inspectors to worry about. No insurance companies asking questions. What kind of materials are you working with? Demo work mostly. Tearing out old equipment, stripping wire, removing fixtures that contain, well, stuff that probably should be handled by professionals. The picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't reassuring. Eric was essentially working as an unlicensed hazmat removal specialist, handling materials that required special training and equipment. The chemical burns, the unusual cuts, the infection that seemed resistant to standard antibiotics, it all pointed to exposure to industrial toxins. Have you been wearing protective equipment? Eric laughed bitterly. Protective equipment costs money. These jobs, they're bare-bones operations. You bring your own tools, you wear your own gear, and if you complain about safety, they find someone else who won't. Mara finished bandaging his wound and sat back, studying his face. The fever was making him more talkative than he'd been during previous visits, and she sensed an opportunity to understand what was really driving his dangerous choices. Tell me about your living situation now, after the divorce. Studio apartment on the west side. $600 a month, which is about all I can afford after the alimony and lawyer payments. It's got a kitchenette and a fold-out couch. Not exactly what I pictured for myself at 46. The image was stark: a man who'd spent over 2 decades building a life, reduced to living like a college student because his marriage had ended badly. Mara found herself thinking about her own divorce, the way it had stripped away not just a relationship, but an entire sense of identity. Do you have family? Friends who could help? My brother lives in Arizona. We talk maybe twice a year. Linda got most of our friends in the divorce. Turns out they were really her friends who tolerated me. Eric's smile was rueful. Funny how you don't realize how isolated you've become until you're actually alone. There was something in his voice that resonated with Mara's own experience. The way divorce didn't just end a marriage, but seemed to unravel all the connections that had been built around it. She'd felt that isolation herself, the gradual realization that the social life she'd thought was hers had actually belonged to the couple she and her ex-husband had been together. What about your work friends? People from Henderson and Sons? Good guys, but they've got their own families, their own problems. And honestly, I'm embarrassed. Bill Henderson thought I had my life together. These guys see me as someone who knew what he was doing. I can't exactly tell them I'm living in a studio apartment and taking dangerous work because I can't pay my bills. The pride and shame in Eric's voice were equally strong, and Mara recognized the toxic combination that kept people from seeking help when they needed it most. The same pride that had kept her from reaching out to friends after her divorce. The same shame that made every struggle feel like a personal failure rather than a circumstance that could happen to anyone. Eric, a Friday job, what exactly are they asking you to do? His expression closed off slightly, but the fever made it harder for him to maintain his defenses. There's an old factory building on the south side. Been abandoned for maybe 10 years. The new owners want it cleared out before they demolish it, but they want it done fast and quiet. Why quiet? Because there's probably still equipment in there that should have been properly disposed of years ago. Machinery with asbestos insulation, old transformers that might contain PCBs, that kind of thing. The kind of stuff that costs a fortune to remove legally. Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. So they're asking you to remove hazardous materials without proper training or equipment. They're asking me to clear out a building. What I find in there is between me and my conscience. And they're paying you enough to risk your health. They're paying me enough to keep my apartment for another few months and maybe get the creditors off my back long enough to figure out something more permanent. Eric met her eyes directly. You think I don't know this is dangerous? You think I'm stupid? I think you're desperate. And desperate people make choices they wouldn't normally make. The honesty of her response seemed to surprise him. He'd clearly expected judgment or a lecture about making better decisions. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I guess that's exactly what I am. Mara finished updating his chart and prepared a new prescription for stronger antibiotics, though she knew they wouldn't be enough if he continued exposing himself to contaminated environments. Eric, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Is there any way at all that you could postpone this job until you're healthy? The guys I work for, they're not the patient type. You miss a job, you don't get called for the next one. And right now, these jobs are the only thing keeping me from losing everything. What if you lost your life instead? Eric was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was so soft she had to lean forward to hear him. Some days that doesn't seem like the worst thing that could happen. The words hung in the air between them, and Mara felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just about medical noncompliance anymore. This was about a man who lost so much of what gave his life, meaning that he was willing to gamble with the only thing he had left. Eric, that's not true, isn't it? I'm 46 years old, living in a studio apartment, taking jobs that could kill me just to pay bills for a life that doesn't exist anymore. What exactly am I fighting to preserve? Mara found herself sharing something she'd never told a patient before. 3 years ago, after my divorce, I felt exactly the same way. Like everything I'd worked for had been erased, like I was starting over at an age when I should have had things figured out. Eric looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten that the people treating him might have their own struggles. What changed? Honestly, I'm still figuring that out. But I know that giving up isn't the answer. And I know that you taking this job while you're sick isn't going to solve your real problems. Eric stood up slowly, testing his balance. Maybe. Not, but it's going to solve my immediate problems. And right now, that's all I can handle. As he prepared to leave, Mara made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Eric, if you're determined to do this job, I want you to have my personal cell phone number. If something goes wrong, if you feel worse, if anything happens, you call me immediately. She wrote her number on the back of a business card and handed it to him. Day or night, I mean it. Eric looked at the card for a long moment, then slipped it into his wallet next to the divorce papers he still carried. Why are you doing this? Because sometimes we all need someone to care whether we make it through the night. That evening, Mara sat in her apartment staring at the empty picture frame on her end table, the frame that had once held a photo of her and David on their 10th wedding anniversary. Smiling and sunburned from a vacation in Key West, she'd removed the photo months ago but kept the frame, though she couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was a reminder of what she'd lost, or maybe it was a placeholder for whatever came next. Tonight, it felt like a symbol of all the connections she'd let slip away. The conversation with Eric had stirred up feelings she'd been carefully avoiding for 3 years. The recognition in his voice when he talked about isolation, about feeling like his life had been erased, she knew that feeling intimately. But hearing it from someone else made her realize how far she'd retreated from any meaningful human connection. She found herself picking up her laptop and searching for Henderson and Sons Construction, curious about Eric's regular job and the life he'd described. The company website showed exactly what he'd said, a small, family-owned business that specialized in commercial construction. Bill Henderson's photo showed a man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands, someone who looked like he gave a struggling employee the benefit of the doubt. The project gallery featured modest but well-built structures, the kind of honest work Eric had taken pride in before desperation drove him to more dangerous alternatives. On impulse, she searched further, looking up recent news about the construction industry in their area. What she found was troubling. Several articles about layoffs at major contractors, stories about experienced workers taking side jobs to make ends meet, and buried deeper in her search results, a few mentions of underground demolition work and the injuries that sometimes resulted. One article in particular caught her attention. Construction worker hospitalized after exposure to asbestos during illegal demolition. The story was from 18 months ago, but it described exactly the kind of work Eric had hinted at. The worker in question had spent 3 days in intensive care after developing severe respiratory complications, and the company that hired him had disappeared, leaving him with no insurance coverage and no legal recourse. Mara's phone rang. Interrupting her research, Dr. Chun's name appeared on the caller ID. Patricia, is everything okay? I wanted to check on you. You seemed unusually invested in that patient today, Eric Dalton. It's not like you to give out your personal number. Mara appreciated Dr. Chun's directness. They'd worked together long enough to be honest about professional boundaries, and when those boundaries might need to be flexible. I think he's in real danger. Not just medical danger, he's taking jobs that could get him killed, and he's doing it because he doesn't see any other options. And you think getting personally involved is going to help him make better decisions? I don't know. But I think letting him face this alone isn't going to help either. Dr. Chun was quiet for a moment. Mara, I've noticed you've been different lately, more engaged with patients, but also more, I don't know how to put this, more emotionally invested. Is everything okay with you? The question caught Mara off guard. She'd thought she'd been maintaining her professional demeanor, but apparently her colleagues had noticed changes she wasn't aware of making. I'm fine. Just maybe realizing that sometimes our job involves more than treating symptoms. That's true, but it also involves recognizing when we can't fix everything. Some people have to make their own mistakes. After Dr. Chun hung up, Mara continued her research, this time looking into the specific risks Eric might be facing. What she found made her stomach tighten with worry. Buildings abandoned for years often contained not just asbestos and PCBs, but lead paint, industrial chemicals, and in some cases, contaminated materials from previous industrial uses. Workers without proper training and equipment face risks, ranging from chemical burns to respiratory failure to heavy metal poisoning. The next morning at work, Mara found herself checking her phone repeatedly, hoping for a call or text from Eric, but simultaneously dreading what such contact might mean. She treated her usual roster of patients, a teenager with a sports injury, an elderly woman with a minor allergic reaction, a construction worker with a deep cut that he properly cleaned and cared for, but part of her attention remained focused on Eric's situation. During her lunch break, she made a decision that surprised her with its spontaneity. She looked up Eric's address from his patient file and decided to drive by his apartment complex. She told herself she was just curious about his living situation, but she knew the truth was more complicated. She was worried about him in a way that went beyond professional concern. The West Side Garden Apartments were exactly what she'd expected from Eric's description, a 2-story complex built in the 1970s that had seen better decades. The parking lot was cracked and partially flooded from recent rain, and several of the building's exterior lights were broken. Eric's pickup truck was parked in front of Unit 23B, and she could see a light in what she assumed was his window. For a moment, she considered knocking on his door, checking on his condition, maybe bringing him soup or additional medical supplies. But something held her back, the realization that her interest in Eric's welfare had crossed into territory that made her uncomfortable. She was thinking about him like she might think about a friend or family member, not like a patient she treated twice. As she sat in her car, looking at his apartment building, Mara found herself thinking about her own living situation. Her apartment was nicer than Eric's, in a better part of town, but it was equally lifeless. She'd moved there after the divorce and had never bothered to make it feel like home. No plants, no personal decorations beyond the empty picture frame. No signs that someone actually lived there rather than just sleeping there between work shifts. When had she become so disconnected from her own life? When had she stopped investing in anything beyond work, stopped caring about outcomes beyond medical ones? Her phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment her heart jumped, thinking it might be Eric, but it was her sister Sarah, reaching out for the first time in months. Thinking about you, coffee sometime soon? Mara stared at the message for a long time before responding. She and Sarah had grown apart after the divorce, partly because Sarah had never liked David and had been insufferably right about the marriage's problems, and partly because Mara had been embarrassed by her life's implosion. But also, she realized, because she'd stopped putting energy into relationships that required effort or vulnerability. Yes, she texted back. I'd like that. That afternoon, Eric's name appeared on the patient roster, and Mara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. When she called him back to the exam room, she could see immediately that his condition had stabilized somewhat. His fever was lower, and the red streaking around his wound had stopped progressing, though it hadn't improved significantly. The antibiotics are helping, she said, updating his chart. A little, enough that I think I can handle tomorrow night's job. Eric, I know what you're going to say, but I've made my decision. I need the money, and I can't afford to be sick anymore. Mara finished her examination and sat down across from him. Can I ask you something personal? Eric nodded. What did you want to be when you were younger? Before construction, before marriage, before all the responsibilities, what did you dream about? The question seemed to surprise him. That's a weird thing to ask a sick construction worker. Humor me. Eric was quiet for a moment, his expression softening. I wanted to build things. Not just put them together from someone else's plans, but design them. Houses, maybe, or parks. Spaces where people could be happy. Did you ever pursue that? Took some drafting classes at the community college when I was in my 20s. Even did some freelance design work for small projects. But then Linda and I got married, bought the house, started thinking about kids that never came. Steady work seemed more important than dreams. And now? Now I'm 46 years old with an infected leg, living in a studio apartment, and taking jobs that could kill me. I think the time for dreams has probably passed. Mara felt something tighten in her chest. What if it hasn't? What do you mean? What if this is just a rough patch? What if you got healthy, dealt with your immediate financial problems, and then started thinking about what you actually want to do with the rest of your life? Eric looked at her like she was suggesting he grow wings and fly. The rest of my life is going to be spent paying off debt and trying not to end up homeless. There's not going to be room for much else. That's not necessarily true. With respect, Nurse Langley, you don't know my situation. You don't know what I owe or how. Few options I have. You're right. But I know that taking jobs that could kill you isn't going to improve your long-term prospects. Eric stood up, preparing to leave. Maybe not. But it's going to solve my short-term problems. And right now, that's all I can focus on. As he reached the door, he turned back. Can I ask you something? Of course. What did you want to be before you became a nurse? The question caught her off guard. I always wanted to be a nurse. Ever since I was little. And are you happy? Doing what you always wanted to do? Mara found herself unable to answer immediately. The truth was complicated. She'd achieved her childhood dream, but had somehow lost the passion that had driven it. She was competent, experienced, respected, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly fulfilled by her work. I'm working on that, she said finally. Eric nodded like he understood exactly what she meant. Yeah, me too. After he left, Mara found herself staring at the empty picture frame on her desk at work, a smaller version of the one at home, also devoid of photos. For the first time in months, she wondered what picture she might want to put there, what image might represent the life she actually wanted to be living rather than the life she was simply enduring. That evening, she called her sister Sarah and made plans for coffee over the weekend. It wasn't much, but it felt like a beginning. Friday evening came faster than Mara had hoped. She'd spent the day trying to focus on her regular patients, but her thoughts kept drifting to Eric and what he might be facing at the abandoned factory. Around 6 o'clock, unable to concentrate any longer, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. She was going to check on him. The address Eric had mentioned led her to the industrial district on the south side of town, where abandoned buildings stood like monuments to the area's more prosperous past. The factory in question was a sprawling brick structure that had clearly been vacant for years. Weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had weathered to gray. Mara parked across the street and waited, feeling slightly ridiculous but unable to leave. What was she planning to do? Stage a medical intervention in an abandoned building? But something deeper than professional concern kept her there, watching and waiting. Around 7:30. She saw Eric's pickup truck pull into the lot, followed by 2 other vehicles. Even from a distance, she could see Eric moving carefully, still favoring his injured leg. He met with 3 other men near the building's loading dock, and she watched as they unloaded equipment from their truck's tools, tarps, and what looked like makeshift protective gear. The conversation between the men was animated, with gestures toward different parts of the building. Even without being able to hear them, Mara could sense tension in their body language. One of the men, tall, thin, wearing a baseball cap, seemed to be giving instructions, pointing to specific areas of the structure. Eric nodded along, but she could see him shifting his weight frequently, clearly still in pain. After about 20 minutes, the men disappeared inside the building through a side entrance that had been propped open. Lights appeared in various windows as they began their work, and Mara settled in for what she realized might be a long night of waiting. She used the time to research the building's history on her phone. What she found was disturbing. The Riverside Manufacturing Company had operated there from 1962 to 1998, producing industrial adhesives and chemical coatings. The facility had been cited multiple times for environmental violations in its final years, and when it closed, the cleanup had been incomplete due to the company's bankruptcy. According to public records, the building still contained equipment and materials that should have been professionally remediated years ago. The longer she sat there, the more worried she became. Eric wasn't just risking injury from unsafe working conditions. He was potentially being exposed to decades of accumulated industrial toxins. And in his weakened condition, with an infection his body was still fighting, such exposure could be catastrophic. Around 10 o'clock, her phone rang. Eric's name appeared on the caller ID, and she answered before the first ring finished. "Eric, are you okay?" His voice was strained, and she could hear machinery running in the background. "I'm not sure. We found some equipment in here. That's worse than we expected. Industrial furnaces, old transformers, storage tanks with stuff still in them." "Where are you exactly? And what used to be the main production floor?" "The air in here, it's thick. Hard to breathe. And there's this smell like chemicals mixed with something rotten." Mara felt her heart rate increase. "Eric, you need to get out of there. Now. I can't. The job's not done, and if I leave, if you stay, you could be looking at serious chemical exposure. What kind of protective equipment are you wearing?" There was a pause. "Work gloves and a dust mask." "That's what we brought. A dust mask?" Mara's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Eric, for chemical exposure, you need a respirator, proper ventilation, hazmat suits. A dust mask is going to do nothing. The other guys seem fine. The other guys aren't fighting an infection. Your immune system is already compromised. Eric, please, just tell them you're sick and leave." She could hear him moving, his breathing labored. "I tried to suggest we should get better equipment, but the boss said we're just removing fixtures. Not doing full remediation. Says we'll be in and out in a few hours." "What's your boss's name?" "Goes by Marco. I don't think that's his real name." The picture was becoming clearer, and it was worse than Mara had feared. Eric wasn't just working for an unlicensed demolition. True, he was working for people who were actively concealing the hazardous nature of the work to avoid the costs of proper safety protocols. "Eric, I'm going to ask you to do something, and I need you to promise me you'll consider it." "What?" "I'm outside. In the parking lot. I've been waiting here since you arrived." "You're what?" She could hear the surprise and concern in his voice. "I was worried about you. I know that sounds crazy, but I couldn't stop thinking about what you might be facing in there." "Mara, you shouldn't be here. This isn't if these guys see you, then come outside and talk to me, just for a few minutes. Let me see how you're doing." There was a long pause, and she could hear him talking to someone else, though she couldn't make out the words. Finally, he came back on the line. "I'm taking a break. I'll be out in 5 minutes." Mara watched as Eric emerged from the building, moving even more slowly than he had when he'd arrived. In the glow of the parking lot's few working streetlights, she could see that his face was flushed, and he was breathing heavily despite the cool October air. She got out of her car and walked toward him, noting immediately that he smelled like industrial solvents and something else she couldn't identify, something acrid and unpleasant. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Honestly, like hell. My head's pounding, my chest feels tight, and the wound is throbbing worse than it has all week." "Eric, those are signs of chemical exposure. You need to leave. I can't. We're only about halfway done, and Marco's already talking about another job next week if this one goes well. There won't be a next week if you end up in the hospital." Eric leaned against his truck, and Mara could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. "You want to know the truth? I'm scared. Not just of the chemicals, but of what happens if I walk away from this money. I'm already 2 months behind on rent, and my landlord's been leaving messages about eviction. What if there was another way? Like what? What if you could get back to legitimate work? What if there was a way to deal with your debts without risking your life?" Eric laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think I haven't explored every option? I've applied for every construction job in a 50-mile radius. Most of them want younger guys, and the ones that don't pay enough to cover my expenses." "What about bankruptcy? Debt consolidation? There are legal ways to deal with financial problems and destroy what's left of my credit. Make it impossible to ever get a decent apartment or a car loan. I'd rather take my chances with the chemicals." Mara studied his face in the dim light, seeing not just physical exhaustion, but a kind of spiritual defeat that went deeper than his current circumstances. This was a man who'd lost hope, who'd convinced himself that dangerous choices were his only choices. "Eric, can I tell you something?" He nodded. "A year after my divorce, I was sitting in my apartment one night, and I realized I hadn't spoken to another person outside of work in 3 days. Not a phone call, not a conversation, nothing. And I thought, this is what my life has become. This is what I'm defending by not taking risks. What did you do? Nothing for another year. I told myself I was being practical, but I was rebuilding, that I just needed time, but really I was scared. Scared of failing again, scared of being hurt again, scared of discovering that maybe I really wasn't worth much outside of my job." Eric was listening intently now, his attention fully focused on her words. "But tonight, sitting in that car watching you go into this building, I realized something. The safe choices I've been making, they're not actually safe. They're just slow ways of destroying myself instead of fast ways. I don't understand. You're risking your life for money because you think that's your only option. But I've been risking my life for nothing, just letting it slip away one day at a time because I'm too scared to fight for something better. Eric was quiet for a long moment, looking back at the building where his coworkers were continuing their hazardous work. So what are you saying? I'm saying maybe we both need to start making different choices. Maybe you need to walk away from this job, and maybe I need to stop pretending that playing it safe is the same thing as living. Before Eric could respond, one of his coworkers appeared at the building's entrance, shouting something Mara couldn't quite hear, but that clearly indicated Eric was needed back inside. I have to go, Eric said. But Mara, thank you for caring enough to come here. It's been a long time since anyone gave a damn whether I made it through the night. Promise me something. What? If you start feeling worse, dizzy, nauseous, having trouble breathing, you come outside immediately. Don't wait, don't try to push through it. Eric nodded and started walking back toward the building. Halfway there, he turned around. What you said about making different choices, you really think it's possible? At our age, with everything that's happened? I don't know, Mara said honestly. But I think we owe it to ourselves to find out. As Eric disappeared back inside the building, Mara returned to her car, but she didn't leave. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to be a turning point for both of them, and she wanted to be there to see how it ended. Over the weekend, Mara found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, actively researching how to help someone beyond the immediate medical problem. She spent Saturday morning at her kitchen table with her laptop, looking into every resource available for people in Eric's situation. Debt counseling services, construction industry assistance programs, even bankruptcy attorneys who offered free consultations. But more than that, she found herself thinking about their conversation in the parking lot, about the moment when she'd admitted her own fears about playing it safe. That admission had surprised her almost as much as it had surprised Eric. When had she become someone who talked about taking risks instead of actually taking them? Sunday afternoon brought her coffee date with Sarah, the first time they'd met, face-to-face in over 8 months. They chose a small cafe downtown, the kind of place that encouraged long conversations over multiple cups of coffee. You look different, Sarah said after they'd settled into a corner booth. More awake, maybe. What do you mean? For the last few years, every time I've seen you, it's been like you were going through the motions. Like you were present, but not really there. Sarah stirred sugar into her coffee, choosing her words carefully. But today you seem more, I don't know how to describe it, more engaged. Mara found herself telling Sarah about Eric, about the dangerous choices he was making and her growing concern for his welfare. She didn't mention the parking lot surveillance, which even to her sounded like stalking when she thought about it, objectively. But she did talk about the way his situation had made her examine her own life, her own pattern of avoiding risk at all costs. So this patient has made you realize you've been sleepwalking through your own life? Sarah asked. Something like that. When I watched him walk into that building Friday night, knowing he was risking his health for money, I realized I've been doing something similar. Not risking my health, but risking my happiness, my relationships, my chance at a meaningful life. By playing it safe, by playing it dead. There's a difference between being cautious and being paralyzed. Sarah reached across the table and touched Mara's hand. I've been waiting 3 years for you to figure that out. Why didn't you say something? Because you had to get tired of your own isolation before you'd be willing to change it. People can't be talked out of depression or fear. They have to decide for themselves that they're ready to live differently. That evening, Mara did something that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks ago. She went through boxes of photos and mementos she'd stored away after the divorce, looking for images that represented who she'd been before she'd become so careful about everything. She found pictures of herself rock climbing in her 30s, volunteering at a free clinic during nursing school, laughing with friends at parties she'd hosted in her old house. Looking at those photos, she realized that the cautious, isolated woman she'd become wasn't the real her. It was just a defensive response to being hurt. The real her had taken risks, had invested in relationships, had believed that life was worth engaging with fully. She selected one photo herself at a charity fundraiser she'd organized for the free clinic, surrounded by colleagues and friends, her face glowing with the satisfaction of meaningful work, and placed it in the empty frame on her end table. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a beginning. Monday morning brought Eric back to the clinic, though this time he looked worse than she'd ever seen him. His skin had a grayish pallor, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept well. When she took his vital signs, she found elevated blood pressure and a heart rate that indicated his body was under significant stress. How do you feel? She asked, though his appearance already provided much of the answer. Like I've been poisoned, he said with a weak smile, which, considering where I spent Friday night, might not be far from the truth. When Mara examined his wound, she found something that alarmed her. While the infection itself hadn't worsened, significantly, the surrounding tissue showed signs of chemical irritation. Small blisters had formed along the edges of the bandage, and there was a rash extending up his thigh that definitely hadn't been there before. Eric, this looks like chemical burns. What exactly were you exposed to on Friday? More than I expected. When we opened up some of those old storage tanks, there were fumes that made everyone's eyes water. And when we were cutting through old pipes, there was this dust that got everywhere, even through the masks. Mara felt her chest tighten with worry. Did you shower when you got home? Change clothes immediately? I was exhausted. I just collapsed on my couch and slept for about 12 hours. So you were in contaminated clothes for half a day after the exposure. Eric nodded, and she could see in his expression that he was beginning to understand the scope of the problem. Eric, I need to ask you some specific questions about your symptoms. Any nausea, dizziness, difficulty concentrating? All of the above. I threw up twice yesterday, and I keep feeling like I'm going to pass out when I stand up too quickly. Any respiratory issues? Coughing, shortness of breath, chest tightness? Yeah, especially at night. It feels like there's something sitting on my chest. Mara made detailed notes, her concern growing with each symptom Eric described. What he was experiencing wasn't just the aftermath of a difficult job, it was consistent. With acute chemical exposure, possibly to multiple toxins. Have you been in contact with your coworkers? Are they experiencing similar symptoms? Marco called yesterday to set up another job for this weekend. When I mentioned feeling sick, he said that was normal, that everybody feels rough after the first few chemical jobs. The first few? Eric, how many of these jobs are you planning to do? As many as it takes to get caught up on my bills. Marco says there's steady work if I can handle it. Mara sat down across from him, her expression serious. Eric, I need you to understand something. What you're describing isn't normal job-related fatigue. You've been exposed to industrial chemicals that are making you sick. If you continue this work, you could be looking at permanent health problems, liver damage, respiratory disease, neurological issues, but the money won't matter if you're dead or disabled. Mara pulled out her phone and showed him the research she'd done over the weekend. Look, I found several programs that help construction workers who are facing financial difficulties. Debt counseling services, emergency assistance funds, even job placement programs for older workers. Eric looked at the information she compiled, and she could see something shift in his expression. Not quite hope, but maybe the beginning of it. You did this research for me. I did it because I care what happens to you. And because I think you deserve better options than choosing between poverty and poisoning. Why? The question was simple, but the emotion behind it was complex. Why do you care? You barely know me. Mara found herself searching for an answer that was both honest and appropriate. The truth was complicated. Her concern for Eric had awakened something in her that had been dormant for years, a sense of purpose that went beyond simply treating symptoms. Because you remind me that there are people worth fighting for, including myself. Eric was quiet for a long moment, looking at the research materials she'd printed out. Some of these programs, they want you to admit you need help. To basically say you can't handle your own problems. And that's worse than admitting you're willing to die for money. The directness of her question seemed to surprise him. When you put it that way, Eric, there's no shame in needing help. There's only shame in being too proud to accept it when it's offered. Before Eric could respond, Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway. She'd been listening to the conversation, and her expression suggested she had something important to add. Mr. Dalton, I've been reviewing your symptoms and Nurse Langley's notes about your recent chemical exposure. I'm recommending immediate blood work to check for toxin levels, and I want you to see a specialist who deals with occupational health issues. I can't afford. The county has programs for exactly this situation. Workers who've been exposed to hazardous materials without proper protection. Dr. Chun's voice carried the authority of someone who'd navigated these systems before. This isn't about charity, it's about making sure you don't develop long-term health problems that could be prevented with proper treatment. Eric looked between the two women, and Mara could see him struggling with a decision. Pride warring with pragmatism, independence fighting against the reality of his situation. What about the job this weekend? Marco's expecting me. Marco's expecting you to risk your health for his profit, Mara said. How much is he paying you for these jobs? $500 for Friday night. And how much do you think it would cost to treat liver disease or respiratory failure? Eric was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Mara's surprise, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Marco, it's Eric. About this weekend's job, I can't do it. I'm having some health issues from Friday night. Mara could hear shouting from the other end of the line, but Eric continued calmly. I understand you're disappointed, but I need to take care of this before I can work again. When he hung up, Eric looked at Mara with an expression she hadn't seen before, not quite relief, but something approaching it. Well, that's that. I'm officially unemployed again. No, Mara said. You're officially making choices based on what's best for your long-term health and well-being. There's a difference. As Eric prepared to leave with his referrals and appointment information, he turned back to Mara. The picture frame on your desk, it has a photo in it now. Mara glanced at her desk, where she'd placed a small version of the charity fundraiser photo. Yeah, I decided it was time to remember who I used to be. Who was that? Someone who believed that helping people was worth taking risks for. Eric smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. I think she's still there. Just took the right patient to bring her back. After he left, Mara found herself staring at the photo on her desk, but instead of sadness or nostalgia, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for what might come next. 3 days after Eric had refused the weekend job, Mara was finishing her morning rounds when Janet called her to the front desk, her voice unusually tense. Mara, you need to see the news. Channel 7 is reporting on some kind of industrial accident. The television in the waiting room showed aerial footage of the abandoned factory where Eric had worked the previous Friday. But now it was no longer standing. What remained was a pile of twisted metal and concrete, with emergency vehicles surrounding the site and smoke still rising from the debris. Happened around 3 o'clock this morning, the reporter was saying. Initial reports suggest the building collapsed during unauthorized demolition work. Fire department officials confirmed that at least 3 workers were trapped inside when the structure failed. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. If Eric hadn't refused that weekend job, if he hadn't prioritized his health over the money, he would have been in that building when it came down. Her phone rang immediately. Eric's name appeared on the caller ID. Mara, are you watching the news? I'm watching it now. Eric, are you okay? I'm fine. Physically, anyway. But those guys, Marco and the others, they were working on the 2nd floor when it happened. They were trying to remove some heavy equipment without proper structural support. Mara could hear the guilt and shock in his voice. Eric, this isn't your fault, isn't it? I knew the building was unsafe. I knew they were cutting corners on safety. If I had said something, if I had refused to work there the first time, they would have found someone else to do the job. You couldn't have stopped this, maybe, but I could have tried. The news report continued with more details. The building had been condemned for demolition, but the work being done was unauthorized and uninsured. The crew had been attempting to remove valuable copper wiring and metal fixtures before the official demolition, essentially stripping the building for scrap value. Their work had compromised the structural integrity of an already unstable building. Within hours, the story took an even more disturbing turn. Police investigators arrived at the scene and discovered that the building collapse was just the tip of a much larger problem. The unauthorized demolition work was connected to a systematic operation involving multiple condemned buildings throughout the city. Dr. Chen appeared at Mara's side as she watched the continuing news coverage. Isn't this where your patient was? Working? Yes, and if he hadn't gotten sick, if we hadn't convinced him to prioritize his health, he would have been in that building when it collapsed. How many workers were involved? The news is saying 3 were trapped, but Eric mentioned there were usually 4 or 5 on these jobs. As if summoned by their conversation, Eric walked through the clay doors. His face was pale, and Mara could see he was struggling with a mixture of survivor's guilt and shock. I need to tell you something, he said without preamble, about the operation Marco was running. Dr. Chen gestured toward her office. Why don't we talk privately? Once the door was closed, Eric sat heavily in the chair across from Dr. Chen's desk, with Mara taking the seat beside him. I wasn't just a worker on these jobs, Eric began. Marco promoted me to crew foreman after the first few weeks. Said I had experience managing construction projects, but I could keep the other workers safe and efficient. Mara felt a chill of understanding. You were responsible for safety on these job sites, supposedly, but Marco made it clear that safety was secondary to speed and profit. When I tried to suggest we needed better equipment, proper ventilation, structural assessments before removing load-bearing elements, he told me to focus on getting the work done. How many buildings were involved? Dr. Chen asked. At least 6. That I know of. All condemned properties that were scheduled for official demolition. Marco's crew would go in first, strip out anything valuable, and get out before the legitimate demo crews arrived. And the building owners knew about this? Eric was quiet for a moment. I think some of them hired Marco specifically for this purpose. It was a way to recover some value from condemned properties while avoiding the cost of proper hazmat removal. The implications were staggering. What Eric was describing wasn't just unsafe labor practices. It was a systematic conspiracy to circumvent environmental and safety regulations, putting workers at risk while contaminating entire neighborhoods with industrial toxins. Eric, Mara said gently, you need to talk to the police. I know. But if I testify about what I saw, what I participated in, I could be looking at criminal charges. Accessory to environmental crimes, maybe even negligent homicide if those workers don't survive. Dr. Chen leaned forward. What exactly did you do as foreman? I assigned tasks, supervised the work, made sure we met Marco's timelines. When workers complained about safety issues, I was supposed to address their concerns without slowing down the job. Did you ever document safety violations? A few times at first, but Marco made it clear that documentation was unwelcome. He said we were there to work, not to create paper trails. Mara studied Eric's face, seeing the weight of responsibility and regret there. You said workers complained about safety issues? What kind of complaints? Respiratory problems from dust and fumes. Chemical burns from handling materials without proper protection. Dizziness and nausea from working in poorly ventilated spaces. Eric's voice dropped. Symptoms just like the ones I developed after Friday night, and you didn't connect the dots? I connected them, but I convinced myself that the other workers were just less experienced, less tough, that I could handle conditions they couldn't. The room was quiet as the full scope of Eric's situation became clear. He wasn't just a victim of dangerous working conditions, he was someone who had knowingly participated in creating those conditions for other workers. There's something else, Eric said. The building that collapsed this morning, it wasn't the first structural failure. 3 weeks ago, part of a roof collapsed at another site. 2 workers were injured, but Marco paid them cash to keep quiet about it, and he didn't report it. I wanted to. But Marco reminded me that I was there illegally too, that I'd be in as much trouble as anyone if the authorities got involved. Dr. Chen exchanged a look with Mara. Eric, those workers who were injured, did they receive proper medical treatment? Marco sent them to a clinic that doesn't ask too many questions. Paid cash, no insurance claims, no official records. Do you know if they're okay now? One of them, Carlos, developed a persistent cough that never went away. The other guy, Jimmy, started having seizures a few weeks after the accident. Marco said it was unrelated to the work. Mara felt sick. What Eric was describing was a pattern of worker endangerment that had been going on for months, possibly years. And now 3 workers were trapped under tons of concrete and steel, the inevitable result of cutting corners on safety for the sake of profit. Eric, I need to ask you something difficult, she said. If you had continued working these jobs, if you hadn't gotten sick and started questioning the safety issues, how long do you think it would have been before something like this happened? Eric was quiet for a long time. Honestly, I'm surprised it took this long. Every job was more dangerous than the last. We were taking bigger risks, working with less equipment, handling more hazardous materials, and you knew this. I knew it, and I did it anyway because I needed the money. The weight of that admission hung in the air between them. Eric had been willing to risk not just his own life, but the lives of other workers because his financial desperation had overridden his moral compass. What are you going to do now? Dr. Chen asked. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to tell them everything I know about Marco's operation, about the safety violations, about the pattern of worker injuries that were covered up. Even though it might mean criminal charges for you, especially because it might mean criminal charges for me. Eric's voice was steadier now, with a note of resolve that hadn't been there before. Those workers who were trapped, they have families. They trusted me to keep them safe, and I failed them because I was more concerned about my own problems than their well-being. Mara reached out and touched his arm. Eric, what you're planning to do, it takes courage. No, it doesn't. Courage would have been refusing to work for Marco in the first place. Courage would have been speaking up when I saw workers getting sick. This is just finally doing what I should have done months ago. As Eric prepared to leave, Dr. Chen handed him a business card. This is the number for a lawyer who specializes in whistleblower protection. Call him before you talk. To the police. I can't afford. He works pro bono for cases involving worker safety. And Eric, what you're doing is the right thing. It won't bring back the workers who were hurt, but it might prevent others from being endangered. After Eric left, Mara found herself staring at the news coverage of the collapsed building, thinking about how quickly life could change. A week ago, Eric had been willing to risk his health for money. Now he was willing to risk his freedom to protect other workers. Do you think he'll follow through? Dr. Chen asked. Yes, I think he's finally ready to be the person he wants to be, instead of the person his circumstances forced him to become. And what about you? How are you feeling about all this? Mara considered the question carefully, grateful, I think. If Eric hadn't gotten sick, if he hadn't come to us for treatment, he might be under that building right now, and I might still be sleepwalking through my own life, too scared to care about anything beyond my professional responsibilities. So what's next for Eric? He's going to testify, probably face charges, definitely face a long legal battle. But I think he's going to be okay. He's finally fighting for something he believes in. I meant, what's next for you? Mara smiled, surprising herself. I don't know yet. But for the first time in years, I'm excited to find out. The days following Eric's decision to cooperate with authorities unfolded like a carefully orchestrated legal drama, with Mara finding herself unexpectedly cast in a supporting role. The lawyer Dr. Chen had recommended, Marcus Rodriguez, proved to be exactly what Eric needed. Experienced in worker safety cases, passionate about justice, and unintimidated by the complexity of the situation. When Mara first met Marcus at his modest downtown office, she was struck by how different he was from the stereotype of a high-powered attorney. He wore a simple gray suit that had seen better years. His desk was covered with case files rather than expensive decorations, and his manner was direct and unpretentious. Eric's case is both simpler and more complicated than most, Marcus explained to her during their initial meeting. Simpler because he's clearly willing to testify truthfully about what he witnessed. More complicated because his role as foreman makes him potentially liable for the very crimes he's trying to expose. What kind of charges might he face? Depends on what the investigation uncovers. Could be anything from criminal negligence to accessory to manslaughter, depending on whether those trapped workers survive and what Eric's actual level of responsibility was. The trapped workers had become the focal point of media attention throughout the week. 2 had been rescued alive, but with serious injuries: Carlos Mendoza with multiple fractures and a punctured lung, Jimmy Torino with a traumatic brain injury that left his long-term prognosis uncertain. The 3rd worker, David Kim, had died at the scene, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. Eric's cooperation with the investigation had begun immediately, starting with a 6-hour session at the police station where he provided detailed information about Marco's operation. Mara had waited in the parking lot during that first interview, unable to focus on anything else while Eric laid out the full scope of what he'd witnessed and participated in. They want me to wear a wire, Eric told her afterward, his voice exhausted, but determined. Marco doesn't know I was supposed to be in that building. He thinks I'm just another worker who got lucky by being sick. The FBI wants me to arrange a meeting, see if I can get him to admit to the safety violations on tape. The idea terrified Mara more than she was comfortable admitting. Is that safe? Probably not, but neither was working for him in the first place. Over the following week, Eric's transformation became increasingly apparent. The desperate, defensive man who had first walked into Riverside Urgent Care was being replaced by someone with a clear sense of purpose. He was still facing financial Ruin, still dealing with the physical effects of chemical exposure, still wrestling with guilt over his role in creating dangerous conditions for other workers. But there was a steadiness to him now, a sense that he was finally moving towards something meaningful rather than just away from his problems. Mara found herself drawn into Eric's legal preparations in ways that surprised her. Marcus had asked her to document Eric's medical condition and treatment history, which would be important for establishing how his desperation had influenced his decision-making. More significantly, he wanted her to testify about Eric's state of mind during their conversations, particularly his expressions of remorse and his willingness to prioritize worker safety over personal gain. "I've never testified in a criminal case," she told Marcus during one of their preparation sessions. "This isn't really a criminal case yet. It's an investigation that might lead to criminal charges. Your testimony would be about Eric's character, his medical condition, his mental state when he was making these decisions. And that's relevant because it helps establish that Eric wasn't a willing participant in a criminal conspiracy. He was a desperate man making poor choices under extreme financial pressure, who ultimately chose to do the right thing when he understood the full consequences of his actions." The preparation for Eric's undercover meeting with Marco required careful coordination between the FBI, local police, and the district attorney's office. Mara watched Eric practice his approach during sessions at Marcus's office, learning to ask leading questions that might elicit admissions about safety violations and cover-ups. "The key is to sound like you're still interested in working, Agent." Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, explained to Eric during one of these sessions. "You were sick, you missed the collapse, now you're recovered and looking for your next job. You're not accusing him of anything, you're just a worker who needs employment. What if he suspects something, then you walk away? This is an information gathering operation, not a confrontation. We need him to talk about his standard practices, his safety protocols, his relationship with building owners. If he starts getting suspicious, you abort the mission." Mara found herself staying late at the clinic several evenings to help Eric prepare, reviewing his medical records, discussing his symptoms from chemical exposure, helping him understand the technical aspects of his treatment that might come up during legal proceedings. Dr. Chen had given her permission to spend work time on these activities, recognizing that Eric's case had implications for other patients who might be facing similar workplace hazards. 3 weeks ago, I would never have imagined myself helping a patient prepare for an FBI operation," Mara told Eric during one of these evening sessions. 3 weeks ago, I would never have imagined myself agreeing to one. What changed?" Eric was quiet for a moment, organizing the papers Marcus had given him to review. "I think I finally understood the difference between being afraid of consequences and being afraid of myself. I was so scared of losing what little I had left that I was willing to become someone I couldn't respect. And now I'm scared of different things. Scared of going to prison, scared of never being able to work in construction again, scared of spending the rest of my life paying legal bills. But I'm not scared of looking at myself in the mirror anymore." The evening before the undercover meeting, Mara made a decision that surprised her with its spontaneity. She invited Eric to her apartment for dinner, not as a patient, not as part of his legal preparation, but simply as someone whose company she'd come to value. "You don't have to do that," Eric said when she suggested it. "I know this whole situation has already taken up more of your time than it should. I want to. Besides, you shouldn't be alone tonight. You need to be relaxed and focused tomorrow. Not sitting in that studio apartment worrying about everything that could go wrong." Eric's acceptance of her invitation felt like a small but significant step for both of them, an acknowledgement that their relationship had evolved beyond nurse and patient into something more complex and meaningful. Cooking dinner for another person felt strange after years of microwave meals and takeout containers. Mara found herself preparing the kind of meal she used to make when she was married, when feeding someone else had been a regular part of her routine. Pasta with homemade sauce, garlic bread, a simple salad, nothing fancy, but prepared with care. "This is really nice," Eric said, looking around her apartment. "I was expecting something more clinical, I guess." "More like the clinic." Mara looked at her space through his eyes, noticing details she'd stopped seeing, the photos she'd finally placed in frames, the plants she'd impulsively bought over the weekend, the books scattered on her coffee table instead of neatly shelved. "I've been making some changes, trying to make it feel more like a home and less like a place where I happen to sleep." During dinner, they talked about everything except the next day's operation. Eric told her about his early dreams of architectural design, about projects he'd worked on that had given him pride, about the satisfaction of building something lasting and beautiful. Mara shared stories from nursing school, about the patients who had taught her the most important lessons, about the moments when she'd felt most useful and competent. "Can I ask you something personal?" Eric said as they finished eating. "After everything we've been through, I think we're past worrying about what's too personal. What happened to your marriage? I mean, I know you said it was about money, but was that really all it was?" Mara considered the question carefully. "David wanted me to be someone I wasn't. More ambitious, more focused on advancement, more interested in making money than helping people. He thought nursing was beneath my intelligence, that I should go back to school, become a doctor or a hospital administrator. And you didn't want that. I wanted to be good at what I did. I wanted to help people, to be useful, to feel like my work mattered. David saw that as a lack of ambition. Sounds like he didn't understand who you really were. Maybe I stopped being who I really was and became who I thought I was supposed to be. Either way, by the time the marriage ended, I'd lost Touch with the person who used to organize charity fundraisers and volunteer at free clinics. The person in the photo on your desk, exactly. As the evening wound down, Eric helped her clean the dishes, moving around her kitchen with the careful efficiency of someone who'd been taking care of himself for a while. "Thank you," he said as he prepared to leave. "Not just for dinner, but for everything. For caring about what happened to me, for helping me see that there were other options, for believing I could do the right thing, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Thank you for letting me help. I'd forgotten how good it feels to actually make a difference in someone's life." As Eric left, Mara found herself looking forward to the next day with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Tomorrow would determine whether Eric's cooperation would lead to justice for the workers who had been injured and killed, whether the criminal operation would be exposed and shut down, whether Eric would face charges or be recognized as a whistleblower, but more than that, tomorrow would be a test of whether the changes both of them had been making, Eric's commitment to doing the right thing despite the consequences, Mara's willingness to invest in relationships and take meaningful risks would prove sustainable. Under pressure, for the first time in years, Mara felt like she was living in the present rather than simply enduring it, engaged with real stakes and genuine consequences rather than going through the motions of professional competence. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew she wouldn't go back to sleepwalking through her own life. That night, she fell asleep looking at the photo on her end table, but instead of nostalgia for who she used to be, she felt curiosity about who she might become. The morning of Eric's undercover meeting arrived gray and cold, with the kind of October weather that seemed designed to match the gravity of what lay ahead. Mara had barely slept, checking her phone repeatedly throughout the night for messages. From Eric, though she knew he wouldn't contact her until after the operation was complete at the clinic. She found it impossible to concentrate on her regular duties. Dr. Chun noticed her distraction during the morning staff meeting and pulled her aside afterward. "You know, there's nothing you can do to help him today except wait," Dr. Chun said gently. "I know, but that doesn't make the waiting any easier. Have you considered what this means for you? If Eric's testimony leads to criminal charges, if this case goes to trial, you could be involved in legal proceedings for months." Mara had considered it, though not in the clinical way Dr. Chun was suggesting. "Are you asking if I'm prepared for that, or if I think it's worth it?" "Both. 3 weeks ago, I would have said it wasn't my responsibility, that I'd done my job by treating his medical condition and referring him to appropriate resources. But now," Mara paused, trying to find the right words, "now I think some things are worth getting involved in, even when they're complicated and messy and might not end the way we hope." The FBI operation was scheduled for 2 o'clock at a diner on the outskirts of town, a location chosen because it was public enough to be safe, but private enough for a frank conversation. Eric would meet Marco under the pretense of looking for work, having recovered from his illness and eager to get back to the kind of jobs that paid well. Agent Chen had briefed Eric extensively on the kinds of admissions they were hoping to obtain: acknowledgement of the safety violations, discussion of the cover-ups following previous accidents, details about the relationships with building owners who hired Marco's crew specifically to circumvent environmental regulations. "The key is to let him talk," Agent Chen had explained. "Men like Marco are proud of their ability to cut corners and get away with it. If you approach it right, he'll boast about how clever his operation is." At 1:30, Mara received a text from Eric, heading to the meeting. "Whatever happens, thank you for helping me become someone worth saving." The message made her chest tighten with emotion. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd watched Eric transform from a desperate man making dangerous choices into someone willing to risk everything to protect other workers from harm. But more than that, she'd watched him reclaim a sense of purpose and dignity that his circumstances had nearly destroyed. The waiting was excruciating. Mara tried to focus on her patients, but every conversation felt distant and unreal compared to what Eric was facing across town. At 3 o'clock, she found herself checking news websites, looking for any reports of incidents at downtown diners. At 3:30, she called Marcus Rodriguez's office, but his secretary said he was in meetings and couldn't be disturbed. Finally, at 4:15, her phone rang. Eric's name on the caller ID brought immediate relief, followed quickly by apprehension about what the call might contain. "It's over," Eric said without preamble. "I got what they wanted. Are you okay?" "I'm fine." Shaken up, but fine. Marco was God, Mara. He was actually proud of what he'd been doing. Proud of the corners he'd cut, proud of the money he'd saved building owners, proud of how he'd managed to keep workers quiet about injuries. Did he admit to the safety violations? All of them, and more. He told me about other buildings, other workers who'd been hurt, other accidents that were covered up. The FBI has enough evidence now to shut down his entire operation. Mara felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. What happens now? Now they arrest him, probably tonight. And then I wait to see whether the district attorney decides I'm a cooperating witness or a co-conspirator. Eric, you did the right thing. I hope so. I hope it's enough to make up for the wrong things I did before. That evening, Eric came to the clinic as Mara was finishing her shift. She could see the exhaustion in his face, but also something else. A sense of completion, as if he'd finally done something he could be proud of. Agent Chen said the arrest went smoothly. He told her as they walked to her car. Marco didn't even seem surprised. Almost like he'd been expecting it eventually. And the building owners? The people who hired him. That's the next phase of the investigation. Marco gave them names, locations, dates. Apparently, this operation was much bigger than anyone realized. As they drove through town, Eric pointed out 2 buildings where he'd worked for Marco structures that looked innocent enough from the outside but had been filled with industrial toxins that workers had been exposed to without proper protection. Every time I drive past one of these places, I think about the guys who are going to develop health problems years from now because of what we did in there, Eric said quietly. And every time you drive past them, you can also think about the fact that you're the reason it stopped, that there won't be more workers exposed because you had the courage to speak up. They ended up at the same diner where Eric had met Marco earlier that day, though this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of nervous tension and hidden recording equipment, there was just 2 people sharing coffee and trying to process everything that had happened. Can I tell you something? Eric asked. When I walked in there today, I wasn't scared of Marco anymore. I was scared of disappointing you. What do you mean? You believed I could do the right thing even when I didn't believe it myself. You saw something in me that I'd lost track of. I was more afraid of proving you wrong than I was of anything Marco might do. Mara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Eric, you didn't do this for me. You did it because it was right, maybe, but knowing you believed I could do it, that made it possible. As they sat in the diner, Mara found herself thinking about how dramatically both their lives had changed in just 3 weeks. Eric had gone from desperate construction worker, taking dangerous jobs, to whistleblower, helping expose criminal safety violations. She had gone from isolated, professionally competent, but emotionally disconnected nurse to someone willing to invest deeply in another person's welfare. What do you think happens next? She asked. Honestly, I think I'm going to face charges, maybe not as serious as they could have been, but something. And I think my construction career is probably over. Who's going to hire a foreman who testified against his employer? And that doesn't scare you? It terrifies me. But not as much as the thought of going back to who I was 3 weeks ago. Eric reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable when he'd first walked into her clinic with his infected wound and defensive attitude. I need to ask you something, he said. When this is all over, when the legal stuff is settled, when I figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, would you maybe want to have dinner again? Not as nurse and patient, not as part of some crisis, just as 2 people who've helped each other through a difficult time. The question hung in the air between them, representing a possibility that neither of them had been brave enough to acknowledge directly until now. Yes, Mara said simply. I'd like that very much. As they prepared to leave the diner, Eric pulled out his phone and showed her a news alert that had just appeared. Local man helps FBI expose illegal demolition operation. The story was brief, but it identified Eric by name as a cooperating witness whose information had led to multiple arrests and the discovery of a widespread pattern of safety violations. Well, Eric said, reading the article, I guess there's no going back now. Would you want to? Eric considered the question seriously. No. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of just running away from my problems. Even though you don't know what that something is yet, especially because I don't know. It means there are possibilities I haven't considered, chances I haven't blown yet. As Mara drove home that evening, she found herself thinking about possibilities and second chances, about the difference between safety and stagnation, about the courage required to care deeply about outcomes beyond your own immediate comfort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal proceedings, media attention, the complex process of rebuilding a life based on integrity rather than desperation. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what mattered most. 6 weeks later, Mara sat in the gallery of the county courthouse, watching Eric take the witness stand in the criminal trial of Marco Delacroix and 3 building owners who had hired his crew. The courtroom was packed with journalists, families of injured workers, and representatives from various construction and safety organizations who had taken interest in the case. Eric looked different than he had during those desperate weeks when she'd first met him. The infection was long-healed, his color was healthy, and most importantly, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his moral center. He wore a simple navy suit that Marcus had helped him select, and when he placed his hand on the Bible to be sworn in, his voice was steady and clear. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Lisa Hartman, began with straightforward questions about Eric's background and how he'd become involved with Marco's operation. Eric's answers were direct and honest, laying out the financial desperation that had led him to accept increasingly dangerous work. Mr. Dalton, when you first began working for Mr. Delacroix, did you understand that the demolition work was unauthorized? I suspected it, but I chose not to ask too many questions. I needed the money, and I told myself that if the building owners were hiring us, it must be legitimate. When did you realize the work was illegal? Gradually, over several weeks. The lack of proper permits, the requirement to work at night, the instruction not to document safety violations, it became clear that this wasn't standard demolition work. Yet you continued working for Mr. Delacroix. Why? Eric paused, looking directly at the jury. Because I was more afraid of losing my apartment than I was of the consequences of illegal work. I convinced myself that I could manage the risks, that I was tougher than the other workers, that nothing bad would happen to me. Mara watched the jurors' faces as Eric spoke, seeing a mixture of sympathy and concern that suggested they understood the desperation that had driven his choices while recognizing the seriousness of the consequences. The most powerful moment came when Prosecutor Hartman asked Eric about his role as crew foreman and his responsibility for other workers' safety. Mr. Dalton, as foreman, what were your duties regarding worker safety? I was supposed to ensure that all workers followed safety protocols, that they had proper equipment, and that they understood the risks of the work they were doing. Did you fulfill those duties? Eric's voice dropped slightly. No, I did not. I allowed workers to handle hazardous materials without proper protection. I failed to document safety violations that could have prevented injuries. I prioritized Mr. Delacroix's timeline over the workers' well-being. Why? Because Mr. Delacroix made it clear that safety concerns that slowed down the work were unwelcome, and because I was more focused on keeping my job than protecting the people who trusted me to keep them safe. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Klein, attempted to portray Eric as an unreliable witness, seeking to minimize his own culpability by exaggerating his employer's wrongdoing. But Eric's consistent answers and obvious remorse made this strategy largely ineffective. Mr. Dalton, isn't it true that you're testifying against my client only because you've been promised immunity from prosecution? I've been promised nothing. I expect to face charges for my role in these safety violations. I'm testifying because I believe the families of injured and killed workers deserve to know the truth about what happened. But you were desperate for money. Couldn't that desperation have led you to misremember or exaggerate the safety violations you claim to have witnessed? Eric looked directly at Klein. Sir, I wish I could misremember Carlos Mendoza's cough that wouldn't go away, or Jimmy Torino's seizures, or the fact that David Kim died under tons of concrete because we removed structural supports without proper engineering assessment. But I can't forget those things, and I wouldn't want to. During the lunch break, Mara met Eric and Marcus in the courthouse cafe. Eric looked drained but determined, like someone running a marathon who could see the finish line. How do you think it's going? Mara asked Marcus. Better than I expected. Eric's testimony is compelling because it's obviously truthful. He's not trying to minimize his own responsibility, which makes his accusations against the defendants more credible. What about the defense's argument that he's an unreliable witness? Hard to sell when he's admitting to his own criminal behavior? People don't usually lie in ways that make them look worse. That afternoon brought testimony from Dr. Patricia Chun about the medical treatment she'd provided to Eric and the symptoms consistent with chemical exposure. Her professional, detailed account of Eric's condition provided scientific support for his claims about the hazardous working conditions. When Marcus called Mara to testify, she felt nervous for the first time since this whole process had begun. Her role was to provide context about Eric's state of mind during his treatment, particularly his expressions of concern for other workers and his eventual decision to prioritize safety over financial gain. Nurse Langley, in your professional opinion, was Mr. Dalton's decision to cooperate with law enforcement consistent with the character you observed during his medical treatment? Yes, absolutely. From our first conversation, Mr. Dalton showed concern for the welfare of others. Even when he was making poor decisions about his own health, he was worried about the other workers who might be facing similar risks. Did he ever express regret about his involvement in unsafe work practices? Constantly. Even before the building collapse, he was troubled by the symptoms he was developing and worried about what other workers might be experiencing. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Mara's obvious competence and professional credibility made it difficult to challenge her observations about Eric's character and motivations. The most emotional testimony came from Maria Kim, David's widow, who spoke about the impact of her husband's death on their family. She spoke directly to Eric during her victim impact statement, her voice strong despite her obvious grief. Mr. Dalton, I don't hate you. David wouldn't want me to hate you, but I need you to understand that your choices didn't just affect you. They affected my children, who will grow up without their father. They affected our family's financial security. They affected everyone who loved David. Eric listened with tears in his eyes, nodding acknowledgement of every word. When she finished, he asked the judge for permission to respond. Mrs. Kim, I know that nothing I say can bring David back or undo the harm my choices caused your family. But I want you to know that testifying here, accepting responsibility for my role in David's death, is the most important thing I will ever do. Not because it helps me, but because David deserved better from the people who were supposed to keep him safe. The closing arguments were scheduled for the following day, but as Mara left the courthouse that evening, she felt confident that justice was being served. Not just in terms of legal consequences for the defendants, but in the broader sense of truth being told, responsibility being accepted, and systemic problems being exposed. Eric walked her to her car, moving slowly through the October darkness. How are you feeling about tomorrow? She asked, scared. Relieved. Proud, maybe, for the first time in years. Proud of what? Of finally being the person I should have been from the beginning. Of putting other people's safety ahead of my own. Comfort, of telling the truth even when it's painful. As they reached her car, Eric pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket. I wrote letters to all the families affected by the accidents, to Carlos and Jimmy and their wives, to David's children. I wanted them to hear directly from me about what happened and why I made the choices I did. Mara looked at the envelope, recognizing it as the artifact that had come to represent Eric's genuine transformation, his willingness to face the human cost of his actions and take personal responsibility for the harm he'd helped cause. Are you going to send them? Marcus thinks I should wait until after sentencing, but yes, I'm going to send them. They deserve to know that someone accepts responsibility for what happened to their families. The next morning would bring closing, arguments, jury deliberation, and ultimately verdicts that would determine not just legal consequences, but the broader message about accountability and workplace safety. But tonight, Mara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of knowing she played a role in something meaningful, something that mattered beyond the immediate medical problems she'd been trained to solve. 6 months after the trial ended, Mara received a letter that would become one of her most treasured possessions. The return address showed Millfield Correctional Facility, and Eric's familiar handwriting filled 3 pages with updates about his life, his work, and his plans for the future. Dear Mara, the letter began. I hope this finds you well and that the new safety program at the clinic is helping other workers avoid the mistakes I made. I wanted to update you on how things are going here and to thank you again for believing I could become someone worth saving. Eric had been sentenced to 18 months in minimum security prison, a term that reflected both his cooperation with authorities and his genuine remorse for his role in the safety violations. The building owners had received much harsher sentences, while Marco Delacroix was serving 5 years for criminal negligence and conspiracy charges. The work here is different than anything I've done before, the letter continued. I'm teaching construction safety classes to other inmates, many of whom have similar stories about taking dangerous work because they needed money. It's strange, I spent months feeling guilty about the knowledge I had, but didn't use to protect people, and now I'm finally using that knowledge in a way that might actually help. Mara smiled as she read about Eric's teaching responsibilities. The prison's vocational program had recognized his construction experience and asked him to develop a curriculum about workplace safety, proper equipment use, and workers' rights. His classes had become some of the most popular in the facility, with inmates appreciating his honest discussions about the consequences of cutting corners and the importance of speaking up about unsafe conditions. The best part is that some of the guys who complete the program are getting jobs with legitimate contractors, who specifically want workers trained in safety protocols. It turns out that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, actually creates opportunities I never would have imagined. The letter went on to describe Eric's plans for after his release. Several construction companies had expressed interest in hiring him as a safety coordinator, recognizing that his experience with dangerous working conditions and his willingness to testify about their consequences made him uniquely qualified to identify and prevent similar problems. I've also been working with a lawyer who specializes in workers' compensation cases. She thinks my experience could be valuable in helping injured workers navigate the legal system and get the medical care they need. It's not the architectural career I dreamed about when I was young, but it feels like meaningful work. Mara had visited Eric twice during his incarceration, conversations that had been both difficult and rewarding. The first visit, just a month after his sentencing, had found him struggling with depression and uncertainty about his future. But by the second visit, 3 months later, he had found his footing and was clearly thriving in his teaching role. I know this sounds strange, he had told her during that second visit, but I think prison might be the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I deserved punishment, but because it forced me to stop running from my problems and figure out who I actually want to be. The letter concluded with news that touched Mara more deeply than she had expected. I heard from Maria Kim last week. She wrote to thank me for the letter I sent after the trial and to let me know that the settlement money from the building owners will help her kids go to college. She said she's forgiven me, not because what I did was okay, but because she can see I'm trying to make amends. I don't think I'll ever stop feeling responsible for David's death, but knowing his family is going to be okay helps me believe that some good can come from even the worst mistakes. Mara folded the letter carefully and placed it in the photo album she'd started keeping images and mementos from the life she was actively building rather than passively enduring. The album included photos from her reunion with her sister Sarah, pictures from a charity fundraiser she'd organized at the clinic, and documentation of the workplace safety initiative that had grown out of Eric's case. The safety program had become one of Mara's most important professional accomplishments. Working with Dr. Chun and several local attorneys, she had developed protocols for identifying patients whose injuries might be related to unsafe working conditions. The program provided resources for workers facing employer retaliation, connected them with legal assistance, and ensured they received proper medical care regardless of their immigration status or employment situation. We've helped 43 workers in the past 6 months, Mara told the hospital board during her quarterly report. 12 cases involved serious safety violations that have now been corrected. 5 workers received workers' compensation benefits they hadn't known they were entitled to. And we've identified 3 employers who were systematically exposing workers to hazardous conditions. The program had attracted attention from other medical facilities throughout the state, and Mara found herself traveling to conferences and training sessions, sharing Eric's story and the lessons they'd learned about the intersection of medical care and worker advocacy. More personally, Mara's life had expanded in ways she couldn't have imagined when Eric first walked into her clinic. She had reconnected with old friends, started dating a fellow nurse named James who shared her passion for patient advocacy, and begun taking art classes at the community college, a long-delayed exploration of creative interests she'd set aside. During her marriage, the most important thing I learned, she had told a conference audience in Sacramento, is that sometimes the best medical care we can provide goes far beyond treating the immediate symptoms. Sometimes we have to care enough about our patients to get involved in the larger circumstances that are making them sick. On a warm April morning, Mara received a phone call that made her week considerably brighter. Nurse Langley, this is Eric Dalton. I'm getting out tomorrow, and I wondered if you might have time for that dinner we talked about. They met at a small restaurant downtown, the same area where Eric had once done demolition work, but now gentrified into trendy shops and cafes. Eric looked healthier than she'd ever seen him, clear-eyed, relaxed, moving with the confidence of someone who had found his purpose. I start work Monday, he told her over dinner. Henderson and Sons Construction hired me as their safety coordinator. Turns out Bill Henderson had been following the case and decided he wanted someone on staff who really understood the consequences of cutting corners. How does it feel to be going back to construction? Different, better. I'm not going back as someone desperate for any work I can get. I'm going back as someone with specific expertise and a clear mission. They talked about his teaching experience in prison, about Mara's safety program, about the ongoing legal cases resulting from the investigation Eric's testimony had launched. But mostly they talked about the future Eric's plans to advocate for stronger safety regulations, Mara's ideas for expanding the worker advocacy program, their shared sense that they were finally living with purpose rather than just surviving that as they prepared to leave the restaurant. Eric pulled out a small, wrapped package. I wanted to give you something, he said. It's not much, but it seemed appropriate. Inside was a simple picture frame, handcrafted from reclaimed wood. A small plaque on the bottom read, for someone who sees people worth saving. I made it in a prison workshop, Eric explained. I thought maybe you could use it for a picture of whatever comes next. Mara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. It's perfect. As they walked to their cars, Eric stopped and turned to face her. Mara, I need you to know something. When I walked into your clinic that first day, I was a man who had given up on himself. I was willing to risk my life for money because I didn't think my life was worth much anyway. You didn't just treat my infection, you helped me remember that I was someone worth saving. Eric, you saved yourself. You just cared enough to see past my defenses to the person I could become. You took risks to help me when you didn't have to. You believed I could do the right thing, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. They stood in the spring evening air, two people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by their unlikely meeting in a suburban urgent care clinic. What's next? Mara asked. For me? Work that matters, relationships that are honest, a life I can be proud of. Eric smiled, the first completely uncomplicated smile she'd ever seen from him. For us, I'd like to find out. If you're interested, I'm interested. As Mara drove home that evening, she thought about the journey that had brought them both to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a competent but disconnected professional, going through the motions of caring without really investing in outcomes beyond the immediate medical problem. Eric had been a desperate man making dangerous choices, convinced that his only options were bad ones. Tonight, she was someone who had learned to take meaningful risks, to invest in relationships that might be complicated but were definitely real. Eric was someone who had found a way to transform his worst mistakes into a mission that could prevent others from making similar choices. When she got home, Mara placed Eric's handmade frame on her kitchen table and considered what picture she might put in it. Not something from the past, but something that represented the future she was actively creating, perhaps a photo from the next charity fundraiser, or a picture of her and Eric working together on the safety program, or simply an image that captured this moment of possibility and hope. For the first time in years, Mara fell asleep excited about tomorrow, about the choices she would make and the people she would help, and the life she was finally brave enough to live fully. The empty frame could wait. She had a feeling that whatever came next would be worth documenting. Sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones who insist they're fine. But sometimes, if they're lucky enough to encounter someone who cares enough to look past the surface, they discover that being fine was never the goal anyway. The goal was being real, being honest, being willing to fight for something better than just surviving. Eric and Mara had found that something better. And in doing so, they had given each other the greatest gift possible, the courage to become who they were meant to be.